This has been a lifelong project for me to be able to make a complete statement as a composer just using the sounds that I'm generating from the trumpet in real time. But I have this bespoke live sampling software that lets me feed my live sound into those MIDI sequences so that it's different every time I do it.
My guest today is renowned musician, composer, and inventor of the groundbreaking Mutantrumpet, Ben Neill. Ben's Mutantrumpet is a hybrid electro-acoustic instrument that combines 3 trumpets and a trombone into one. It then incorporates interactive computer technologies that produces a sound that blurs the lines between acoustic and electronic music. Ben became interested in electronic music when he was the music curator of the New York City performance space, The Kitchen, from 1992 to 1999. And since that time, he's been incorporating electronic influences into his work. This includes 13 albums, as well as exhibitions in museums and galleries in New York City and London. Ben began his teaching career in 2007 as a professor of music technology at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and was a professor of music industry and production at Ramapo College until 2024. His new book is called Diffusing Music and explores how technology is enabling new levels of creativity and transforming how we share and experience sound. During the interview, we talked about why the Mutantrumpet was developed, using an AR headset during performances, the future of music collaboration, how music reflects society, and much more. I spoke with Ben from a studio outside of New York City. Thanks for doing this. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Oh, I'm really excited to meet you. I've used your materials in my teaching for years, and followed your email, newsletter and everything. And I mean, you're a major figure in the industry, so I was very happy that Ariel was able to hook this up. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind.
Yeah.
I'll tell you where I want to start, and I do want to talk about your book, and we'll get to it, but we have to start with the Mutantrumpet first. I want to know how that came about. What was the impetus for it?
Well, I started out as a classical trumpet player, and I was fooling around a lot with playing music that used a lot of different mutes. And so I just got this idea of possibly having an extra bell on the trumpet. And I had a trumpet that I could remove the bell from, and I started just sticking it onto the first valve slide. But that meant that the first valve wasn't operable. So I happened to be working with a guy who had worked in the King Instrument Factory at the time, and we kind of got this idea to just try to see if we could cobble something together. And at the same time, I was really starting to veer away from classical music. Even though I enjoyed playing it to some degree, my musical interests were a lot more diverse. I really grew up listening a lot to art rock and electronic music and, more like ECM type jazz. And I found myself really wanting to shift toward a more creative career. And one of my trumpet teachers actually encouraged me to do that, to start thinking about composing. And so it just became more and more serious. And then I approached Robert Moog. This was in the early 80s when he had sold his interest in the Moog company. I saw an ad in Keyboard magazine that he was looking for independent projects, and he built the first analog electronic processing system for me, because that was always my vision, was to have it be a hybrid acoustic and electronic instrument. So it ended up having, we put 2 trumpets together. I mean, you want me to show it to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can see it's got 3 bells instead of the normal single bell. And then you have 2 sets of valves that these are regular pitch valves. These valves switch between the 3 different bells. The one bell is on a slide. It's got a trombone slide. And then I worked at the Stime Studios in Amsterdam beginning in the early 90s to make it fully MIDI compatible. So these are all MIDI controllers. It has a distance sensor, XY joysticks up here, MIDI switches, a fader, and potentiometers. And there's a pickup in the mouthpiece that is used for the pitch sensing. So as I'm playing, my notes and dynamics are turned into MIDI. And then I've got a microphone on the bell that captures the sound, because a lot of what I do with it is live sampling. I take my acoustic sound and then sample that live, not just looping, actually sampling. And so that's kind of, how it evolved. I mean, it started out as kind of a whim, and it just became more and more serious over the years. Yeah.
I was watching one of your videos on YouTube, and the first thing I thought about was, wow, you beat Ed Sheeran by decades.
Well, yeah, I mean, I always wanted to keep the acoustic element of it. That was really important to me. Like, I never really got so interested in the wind controllers and, just like a pure electronic instrument. My whole concept and really my whole artistic project has really been tied into this idea of merging traditional conventional instrumentation and performance, instrumental performance with emerging technologies into a really, kind of synergy where they come together, a kind of cybernetic approach.
When I was listening to your demos on your site, actually,
yeah,
I was listening to them and I'm thinking, doesn't sound like any trumpet I've ever heard before. And it was hard for me to kind of get my arms around it until I went to YouTube and watched your video of you explaining everything.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, I get exactly what's going on now.
Well, that is one of the issues with doing this kind of work, is that it is difficult sometimes to convey to the listener or to the audience exactly what's going on. I mean, this has been a lifelong project for me. I mean, I've been working on it for 40 years, literally. And I really only feel that in the last couple of years have I been able to totally realize the vision that I originally had, which was to be able to make a complete statement as a composer, as a musical artist, just using the sounds that I'm generating from the trumpet in real time. And yeah, maybe a couple of drum beats and things like that I bring in from other places, but mostly, and I think you see that in those demos, that I have MIDI sequences and MIDI controlled processing set up inside of Ableton, but I have this bespoke live sampling software that lets me feed my live sound into those MIDI sequences so that it's different every time I do it. But yet it's not completely free form either. And I've always been more interested in music that has a bit more structure. I've never been so interested in just a really free improvisational approach. I like working with beats and rhythm and tonality and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's been something that it keeps going. And one of the other things that I do to try to accentuate what I'm doing live is working with interactive video, which I show in the demos as well. Because sometimes I feel like if I'm going bop, 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 bop like that, and you're seeing something moving around the screen, like maybe people make a connection, but still sometimes people will come up at the end and say, oh, you were controlling that live? I'm kind of like, oh.
Yeah. Well, that being said, the one video I watched, you had an AR headset as well.
Yeah. I was using that to be able to that was for a piece that I did where I wanted to be able to see what I was playing and what I was triggering while I was moving around and stuff. So yeah.
That's pretty cutting edge there, Ben.
Hey, well, that's been my thing. Again, it's been my artistic project, but also I come back to the fact that, I think in a way, even though I worked in a lot of these very experimental music scenes and facilities and things, I was always more interested in trying to use the instrument to create music that people would actually want to listen to. Because what happens a lot of times in these more laboratory kinds of institutions and things that I have had a lot of experience in is it's kind of the only people that want to listen to that kind of music are the other people that are doing it, And for me, my whole going back to what was my original impetus, it was that I wanted to get out of the limitations of just having a life in classical music, and really where I found my footing and found my audience was in the ambient electronica scene of the 90s. So the 80s was kind of, a lot of development. I worked with older minimalist composers in downtown New York. But then when the whole ambient electronica thing really started happening, that I felt like that was really the genre where I was able to best, fit into and find more of that kind of an audience. And then I got into doing music for film and TV. I did a lot of music for Volkswagen, Cadillac, and things like that, which was also a lot of fun. To bring this experimental kind of sensibility into actually doing something like that, So
how did you get into the electronic music scene? It doesn't seem, it's not connected really with the classical scene at all.
Well, I was working in the downtown music scene, downtown New York in the 80s, and there was a lot of interest at that time in bringing together basically minimalism, ideas for minimalism with more popular music. Of course, Philip Glass and Steve Reich. Philip Glass in particular was kind of crossing over into popular music with his work with Bowie. And I worked with this other composer, Rhys Chatham, who was doing these big electric guitar symphonies, which kind of combined punk rock with more minimalism. And so, yeah, I guess but really, when it was in the late 80s, when the whole new DJ culture, it really, started a lot of it from the UK. But then in New York, there started to be a much more vibrant DJ scene. And I was, very interested in that. I immediately gravitated toward it. And I was curating music at a place in New York called The Kitchen at that time. It's a pretty well-known place for that kind of launched the careers of, or it was important in the careers of the Talking Heads and Laurie Anderson. Again, people who kind of crossed over between more experimental music and popular culture. So, that was really had been going on all through the 80s, and then in the 90s, it happened like even more. And I made a real effort to work with DJs and to get involved in playing in scenes and clubs with DJs, and I did a lot of presenting of that type of music as well, which helped me to really get a sense of collaboration with the people that were doing that. And I really learned a lot from that. I feel like in a lot of ways, and that's something I talk about in the book quite a bit, that I feel like the DJ is a really important kind of figure model for, what the artist is in the 21st century. And just, the idea that it's not necessarily always doing something that's really your own thing, but just putting things together in a certain way can also be extremely important,
You're very musically open-minded because there was a real dichotomy between real musicians and DJs.
That's true.
And, it was, and anybody that was serious, or so-called serious musician was, appalled by the rise of the DJ culture. So for you to embrace it like that, that requires an open mind, I have to say.
Well, I appreciate that. I will say that some of the people in some of the more traditional scenes, more experimental music scenes didn't like that. They and when I started doing things like doing music for commercials and things like that, they were really appalled by that, But again, my whole goal in doing my own music was to try to do something that would reach more people and that would, would give me the ability to, have my sounds be heard. And I also just really liked the music. I was, as I said, I was always interested in groove-based music and repetitive music. So I was a bit on the experimental fringes of electronica, more in the realm of Aphex Twin, Future Sound of London. I never did a lot of like big four on the floor, main room dance music. I was more into breaks and down tempo, trip hop, and then drum and bass too. But yeah, I appreciate that, and it is something that I think kind of differentiates me from a lot of people that have been involved in this kind of instrumental experimentation, is that I was very much enthusiastic about embracing that new kind of a sensibility. Yeah.
But what I get from you, Ben, is that you were enthusiastically embracing it, like, hey, this is cool, rather than saying, well, I have to do this because it's hot now.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference there.
Yeah. Well, and there were also a lot of the same sensibilities that I had been exposed to and coming to New York in the early 80s. I mean, as soon as I hit New York in the early 80s, I mean, sampling was really the thing, and I got interested in that because I was so immersed in it. And in a way, I mean, obviously DJs really invented sampling. I mean, that's where sampling came from, it was from hip hop. And I mean, you could say Stockhausen and, people like that had something to do with it too. But yeah, that whole sensibility of sampling and appropriation was something that by the 90s it was pretty well established, and so it wasn't such a big leap for me to make that move and think more about incorporating sampling and borrowing of things, which I had been doing that even in my earliest compositions, like kind of mixing different styles of music together that wouldn't necessarily be thought of as being compatible and that kind of thing.
We sort of touched on this earlier, but let's talk about diffusing music, your book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how did this come about? What's it about, and how did it come about?
Well, for the last 16 years, I've been a professor at Ramapo College in New Jersey of music technology and music industry. And I felt like as a result of that experience and also just the things we've been talking about, my whole trajectory as a musical artist, that I wanted to write something about this phenomenon of musical democratization, which I see as being so much the thing that characterizes our age, that's so distinctive about our age, is the fact that more and more and more people are doing music, and it's being opened up to different kinds of people. It's becoming more participatory literally every day. And I think there's a lot of alarm about that. There's a lot of concern, particularly about AI and the really new technologies. But my goal in writing the book was to kind of contextualize these things historically, both going back beyond my own career to earlier 20th century kind of experimental music and jazz and different things, and then also to kind of weave my own autobiography into it and try to contextualize it, trace that this is a trajectory that it was, in a sense. A lot of people, I feel like, are saying that this is some kind of shocking thing. But to me, what I'm kind of trying to say, it was an inevitability. This has been in the works. People have been talking and practicing this idea of opening up music, and for that matter, all of the arts, for decades. And maybe that can help us to look at ways to approach these new things, because I think we've learned the lesson by now that once these things are introduced, they tend to not go away as much as we might want them to. And so to be able to look ahead and see how we might continue to appreciate and value the art of music, realizing that it's going to be different. One of my favorite things around this idea is in David Byrne's book, where he talks about music and it's always being influenced by the context it's in. He talks about different architecture and how the architecture of the churches for Gregorian chant made them do one type of music, and then he goes through all history until he gets up to cars and boom boxes and then finally headphones. Well, I feel like the environment or the context for music going forward is a world where everyone is making music, and more people want to participate in the musical act. Eno has talked about how the whole idea of the individual genius is being replaced by this idea of scenius, that things really emerge out of collectives. And I remember there's another quote that he says about how the whole idea of a fixed recording might even eventually just go away, because it may end up being something that's much more fluid and interactive. How do we maintain a connection and a value to the art of music if we're looking at that kind of radical transformation? That was my goal, was to try to bring my experience as someone who is later in my career and try to kind of make a bridge between the things that I've done and where we're going in the future.
You just brought something up that made me think about things a little differently, and that's the value of scenes and how they change music.
Yeah.
And yes, that's true. But now the fact that everybody can make music and they can do it in their bedroom, they can do it from their laptop, does that negate the scene, since there's not a lot of people congregating like they did before and sharing the music?
I see that's obviously an issue. I remember Bob Moog I think it's in the Moog documentary near the end, where he was asked, what was concerned him, and he was saying about the technology, and he was like, well, I see more and more people making music by themselves and listening to music by themselves, and that, so if you remove that social aspect, obviously there is a loss there. But I guess what I see is, well, first of all, I think there are still scenes. I mean, certainly you get into like the Bushwick in New York, and there's still different pockets of things going on. But I understand what you're saying. But that's where I kind of feel like the artist of the future maybe someone who's a bit more involved with trying to find a way to take all of this amateur creativity and shape it or mold it or channel it into something that is their own artistic statement. And I think somebody like Holly Herndon with her Holly Plus project, where she's letting other people use her voice in their music. And I'm actually kind of thinking about doing something with that myself, in the sense that over the years with the Mutant Trumpet, a lot of people have asked me, well, are you interested in selling it? Are you going to market it or something like that? And it's never really been something that I felt like that I could market, because it was just so specific. But now I've got these plugins that I've developed, which I are pretty unique, and Again, I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm actually thinking about doing that, where basically I would be putting out these instruments that would enable other people to do what I do. And in a sense, that's maybe a kind of a new approach to creativity that kind of merges composition and production with technical development.
Okay, you just mentioned about plugins. These are proprietary. These are ones that you just use, right? They're not available to the public.
Yeah. So,
but it's an interesting premise, though, if you think, well, and let's face it, one of the problems with plugins right now, it's such a copycat industry.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's more of the same, and it's like, well, how many of these can you possibly have that do the same thing. But what you're talking about is something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly, I spend a lot of time, looking at a lot of the more, like boutique plugins and things like that. And I mean, that's one of the things that I've been enjoying about some of these AI-driven plugins. And again, there's so much concern and feeling of being threatened about AI, but there's this one that I've been using called Playbeat by Audio Modern. It's an English company. I interview the guy who founded it in my book. And what I like about it is, well, it's basically an 8-part drum machine, and it improvises. You give each part parameters, and you can have it improvised how many notes it plays, the volume, the pitch, the density, all of that. But then what I really like about it is that once it starts doing something that I really like, similar to ChatGPT in a way, I can say, hey, I like that. And then the next time it comes around, it's going to become something that is actually more personalized to me. So, I mean, I feel like everybody's afraid of depersonalization, but the thing about a lot of the way so many people are making music now, and I mean, I experienced this a lot with my students. I mean, you're using Ableton, you're using Logic. I mean, everybody's basically using the same loops and the same plugins. And, so having, I think, and that's something that I started a master's in creative music technology at my school a few years ago. And we really are putting a lot of emphasis in our curriculum on programming and developing your own ways of doing of basically making your own plugins and coming up with your own processes rather than just using the same stuff that everybody else is using.
But see, I think that's the way to approach AI for a musician, in that there are ways to incorporate this into your workflow that's going to make things better in some way. And I'm not going to say it's easier, it's just better in some ways. But most musicians who haven't played with AI think of Boomy, for instance, or something that's creating a whole track for you. Not very well, but creating a track that sounds reasonably well. And they're threatened by that. Yeah. And yet there's a big pushback against that. So, you shouldn't be that threatened, I guess.
Well, I mean, to me, there's a lot of similarities with sampling. And there's a lot of similarities, with other things that have happened. If you look at the whole history of music and technology, every single innovation was resisted. Recordings, radio, there was always like this fear. And in sampling, of course, everybody was really concerned about that. Well, yeah, okay, so if you just take somebody else's recording and you just plop it straight down into your recording, that's not very interesting. I mean, so what people ended up doing, though, with sampling was like doing really creative things with it and changing it and then incorporating it into their own vocabulary. Now, I can see that the power of the AI is greater, obviously. It has a different level of potential. But I think, there's this book out, Co-Intelligence, that talks about this. And the whole idea that what AI really is, it's really collective intelligence. And I know that gets into like all the issues with legal, copyright and all that. But I think, it's ultimately just like sampling, what's going to be interesting about it for music. And frankly, even for writing. I mean, to me, I use ChatGPT sometimes now. I did not use it for my book, but I do find it useful for things like, let's say, maybe I'm working on a press release for a new project or something like that, and I write something, I put it in there, I say, okay, give me a couple of different versions, and then it gives it back to me, and I work on it some more. To me, it's a collaborator. It's not something to just replace you, at least. And I think that's, at least for now, the way to think about it, that is not so threatening. And again, I don't think it's something that's going to go away. We need to, again, one of the things that I talk about in my book is that historically, when these new technologies are first appearing, it's kind of important for people to engage with them, because sometimes the early adopters are the ones who actually determine the patterns and the way that it gets used for the masses who follow, So right now I feel like it's kind of, and that was one of the reasons that I wanted to do this book. Of course, I started it 5 years ago before AI was really even, such a thing. But the musical democratization, the superabundance of music and everything is all tied into that, and so, yeah, I that's the way I'm trying to think about it, is as a collaborative tool.
Okay, so now one of the big problems of all this, the democratization of music, is the fact that there's so much of it out there.
Yeah.
And one of the advantages of when it wasn't so widespread was the fact that you did have gatekeepers that at least, kept it to a dull roar of, choices that you had.
Yeah.
So this is one of the big problems I see. That being said, now we're seeing Spotify and all the major streaming services say, okay, if you don't have X number of streams in the year, we're going to actually take this off the platform.
Yeah, I noticed you in your 2025 video, you were talking about that. Yeah, and of course the monetization. If you don't have a certain number of plays, it's not going to be monetized. And I mean, it is a big issue. I mean, and truthfully, I think what we've lost is because of the way, when you talk about gatekeepers and, traditional A&R and that, kind of thing, and also criticism, I mean, basically, and again, music is never by itself. I think music, there's one of the books that is a really, huge influence on me. It was a total visionary book by Jacques Attali, the French writer from the late 70s, where, he talked about how oftentimes music actually anticipates things that are going to happen in broader society, like decades ahead. I mean, and in a way, Napster was really the beginning of the whole social media shared information world, So yeah, I mean, I think the fact that we don't really have criticism, just like, we barely have journalism anymore, I mean, the issue is that, and this was one of the things that I frankly found a little bit difficult sometimes with teaching, is that with music, it could be anything. It could be anything now. What is a good snare drum sound? Right?
Depends on
it could be anything.
Yeah.
It could be that. I mean, it's like that's the issue with all this superabundance, is that what tends to happen is, what I see is that it's hard to say that anything is any better than anything else, except for how many people are looking at it or listening to it. And that is democratization, I mean, and how do we square that? How does that fit in with like the whole history of art as we've known it, and museums and things like art history and things like that? What happens to that? It's not really clear. It's Terence McKenna, who was one of my inspirations. Kind of, we were collaborating, before he passed away. A psychedelic philosopher. He had this thing he talked about, the archaic revival, and also Marshall McLuhan talked a lot about the global village, and that we were, through technology, that humans were going to basically go into something that's more like an oral tribal culture, right? That where everything is shared, everything is shared experience, and we don't have that kind of hierarchy or stratification. I do still think, I hope maybe my book will make some contribution to that the whole history of art and the value of art won't be lost. But I don't think there's any question when you're talking about 120,000 tracks a day being released. I mean, that's like, you go in the grocery store one day and there's 10 kinds of cereal, and then you go in the next day and there's 1,000 kinds, I mean, it does something to it.
Yeah, right. Okay, so when you write a book, if you do it well, you have to do a lot of research, and you've obviously done that. And you've worked on it for quite a while, so the research has been ongoing.
Yeah.
And it gives you an insight that most people don't have. So, with that being said, do you see a trend that's happening that maybe others don't?
Well, I'm not sure if I see something that others don't, but what I see is that some of the things we're already talking about, I think music is becoming more and more collaborative. Everything is going to, and we see that even in, pop music with Beyonce's albums with 20 writers and that kind of thing. And I'm doing a new album right now that is called Amalgam Sphere, and it's all about each song. I have different types of collaborators, and then also using some of these AI programs and things like that. So, yeah, I think it's going to be going away from the sort of, Renaissance idea of, the genius artist who comes up with this brilliant thing that blows everybody away and then gets, lauded and put up on the pedestal. I think there's going to be less and less of that. And it's going to be much more of learning to operate in this new kind of an environment where everything is much more collective. But hopefully, we won't lose the whole sense of what came before. But, a lot of people, going back to McLuhan, and I taught a course a few years ago that was for all different kinds of majors in an honors seminar. And I used his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy. And, McLuhan didn't live long enough to see the internet, but he talked a lot about how television and media were really like the printing press. And, the printing press really changed human consciousness. And it took a long time for it to really have its full effect. And I think I tend to subscribe to that. And I think we're at the very beginning of this whole new kind of sensibility where by giving everyone, the printing press gave everyone the ability to read. Now we've given everybody the power to publish. And that creates a new dynamic, and that is, I think, necessarily going to be more collaborative and collective in nature.
All right, last question, Ben. You listen to my podcast, you know what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's the best piece of advice that maybe somebody imparted to you, or maybe you learned along the way?
Wow, the best piece of advice. I mean, there's a few, but I would say, I think with music, I'll say just like specifically with music, I got pretty interested over the last years in something around the whole idea of music cognition studies. And it's music conveys emotion by doing something to our expectations, by challenging or thwarting our expectations in some way. So what makes a piece of music move people is when something happens that they don't expect. But that has to happen within the context of the music. So if it's a house track, your threshold for that is going to be a lot less than, an atonal classical music piece. But whatever music you're making, to always think about, once you start the song or the piece, you're setting up an expectation of what's going to come next. And what makes music great and what makes people feel is when something happens that they don't expect. And that doesn't mean that it's scientific, but there is a kind of this whole scientific way of that they're analyzing different kinds of music and music not just from one particular style. And that's, to me, that's really exciting to start thinking about how we could look at music across all different styles and all different cultures and find something like that seems to be a kind of universal.
It's a good place to stop. Thank you, Ben. That's very cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. You can also learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news, and find out about openings for my latest online classes at bobbyowsinski.com. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.